First of all, I want to say thank you to the Mississauga, the New Credit, for allowing us to be here today. As Mr. Searson has pointed out, that my name is Howard Grant, and I'm from the Musqueam First Nation, but I'm also the Executive Director for the First Nations Summit. And at this time, I would like to say as well, thank you to the IOG for inviting me to speak to you today as well. Part of my bio is that I was a recipient as a young man of Indian Affairs funding. I then became a deliverer of that funding I was known as an Indian agent. I was the Associate Director of Operations within government. And then I became a liaison officer in regards to how to implement a lot of the funding arrangements. So I have a bit of a history with the funding and whatnot with respect to the Crown and First Nations. But before I go into my presentation, I want to say, Michael's not here, but I wanted to say thank you to him because he just reduced my presentation by 15 minutes because what he said was exactly what I was going to say. In my presentation, I'll speak about the background in regards to what is the new fiscal relationship and challenges and impacts of the current new fiscal relationship, why now, and reframing the relationship in what is needed. But before I go into that, I just wanted to cite some memorabilia and comments that were presented over time that I'm a hoarder of things. Pierre Elliott Trudeau, when he was the Prime Minister of Canada, once said to First Nations, "Why do you fight so hard? Because within 2 generations, you're going to be like us." I'd like to say today that we're more Indigenous than ever before, that we've really placed our foothold into the foundations and roots of our people. And then Harry Swain, a previous deputy minister, also once said, "So long as there is an Indian Act and you have a fiduciary obligation, we, the Indigenous Northern Affairs Canada, must maintain a footprint within the First Nations communities." That's no longer there. With the downsizing of government and whatnot, that there's very little intelligence nor an understanding of an agency that should be working with First Nations, but they have no understanding whatsoever. So, as well, recognize to dispel some of the myths that are outstanding out there at this moment. One, that Indigenous people on reserve get things for free. I live on reserve, and I can absolutely tell you I get nothing for free. Nothing. And that this exercise that the government is embarking upon now with regards to Minister Rabo and others in regards to this new reconciliation, this new relationship, is nothing new. Nothing new. I have here in front of me the 1970s policy of INAC. It's almost like reading today's newspaper. It's exactly the same. The 6 cabinet members that are part and parcel of that is missing 2 links. One is the Minister of Finance and Treasury Board, who are instrumental in actually making this new fiscal change really happen. So I look at those kinds of things, and then I say, during Paul Martin's era, he said, "I want to move towards a more horizontal management approach." Sad to say, that didn't work. Today, they're trying to do that. Now, they're all falling over each other because of the mandate letters that became transparent by the Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, issued to every federal minister. But in British Columbia, they have a IIIC committee of all RDGs. And I said, quote unquote, If I were the most senior official of government, part of your performance pay would depend upon how many horizontal initiatives that were embarked upon by various departments. In other words, the aggregation of departments working together, because that would be somewhat of an eye-opener. So when I look at the background of how did we come to this point, the Indian Act was devised in part to remove Indigenous peoples' jurisdiction over lands, resources, and our lives. In 1927, the Indian Act was further revised to prevent First Nations from raising revenues to pursue land claims and to hire lawyers to assist them. The current fiscal relationship, premised on such Crown-developed laws, regulations, and policies, reflects bare legal minimums and represents an impoverished and ineffective framework for advancing the relationships and to move us down the path of reconciliation. Today, First Nations communities experience the most rapid population growth, the youngest growing demographic, yet resourcing for our social programs, services, infrastructure in our communities does not reflect population growth nor inflation rates. Key matters around revenue sharing, OSR, own source revenue, offsets, jurisdiction over taxation and services, funding caps, and securing the necessary revenue streams to overcome comparability gaps remain unresolved matters. So that's a bit of the backgrounder in regards to what is the new fiscal relationship. It should include recognition and reconciliation. The overarching financial relationship sets out the agreements and mechanics of the relationship. It is the fiscal mechanism to support First Nations in implementing their constitutionally protected Section 35 jurisdictions. In the Indigenous Crown context, we must consider four basic questions. Which government, i.e. federal, provincial, regional, or First Nations, collects what revenues and mechanisms? Which government pays for this, for what services? Which government provides what services? And who is eligible for what services? Excuse me, I have a cold, so. Challenges and impacts resulting from the current relationship. Dependency. First Nations continue to be reliant in varying degrees on limited government funding generated by revenues generated from our territories and resources, which is collected by the Crown, federal and provincial. We're subjected to formula driven by unilaterally developed formulas, not based on actual needs nor expenditures. Giving a little bit of a historical referencing, in the 1970s, the contributions that were provided to First Nations were very fixed and very rigid, that they were counting widgets on those contribution agreements. In the 1980s, they became more comprehensive and flexible. And by the late 1980s and early 90s, AFA, or a form of block funding, was introduced, which allowed First Nations to expand their abilities. But still, again, it was quite limited because of discretionary versus non-discretionary funding of how it would be expended. Now, today, you find that the government is saying compliance and transparency. And thirdly, which they don't say, is that they're back to counting widgets. So I've come full circle as a young man from the 1960s and 70s to now. The contribution agreements, although they're supposed to be much more flexible and whatnot to First Nations, who are still very dependent upon that government funding, have found themselves now to be counting widgets and making reports that are meaningless. The data that's collected is not even data that is necessary because it goes nowhere and it's not used by anyone to assess nor look forward to how they're achieving any kind of real results. And the money that's there is limited, it's unpredictable funding, it's not sustainable, delays in reliability, impacting on the ability to meet basic needs. And sitting on the Finance Committee of the regional office, you find that April 1, you're supposed to get cash. A contribution agreement that's signed, checks in the banks. Not so. What ends up happening is that you get a notional budget, you get a contribution agreement that's signed, and for the non-discretionary amounts of money, you get an advance. But for the discretionary, non-discretionary, and for those new innovative projects, you probably won't see the light of day of money until September, halfway through the year. Now, how do you cash manage if you have no own source revenue? And sad to say, government then does a report and says Indians don't know how to manage their money. Delivery of government priorities, programs, and services, little to no discretionary spending. It's all predetermined by government-established priorities. Programs, services provided deliverables that do not meet the unique needs of our communities. In other words, well, like I said, compliance. Did you spend it on such and such, as opposed to the needs that have arisen within your community? Compliance and extensive reporting in the name of transparency and accountability for these funds, rather than focusing on our participation in the economy as healthy resource nations providing meaningful programs. A new fiscal relationship? Why now? Excuse me. I've been told I only have a couple of more minutes, so maybe what I'll do is I'll skip a couple of my Why now? Well, I would think that because of important court decisions that have happened over the time, Delgamuukw, Haida, Taku, Chilcotin, Garin, Sparrow, gives reason, justification to move into this new fiscal environment. The right to use and exclusive use of these resources within our First Nations community. We also have a number of institutions in British Columbia that give us support and give us some rationale of justification that we can look after our needs. I should have mentioned earlier that I'm humbled to be here with other First Nations who I look up to. West Bank, Squamish, along with Sechelt and Kamloops and Musqueam, formed the original Alliance Tribal Council, where the genesis of land management, taxation, and self-government formulated itself and was a springboard for where we sit today. And those initiatives are something that West Bank and Squamish and Musqueam have generated a lot of revenues. And more importantly, today, another new phenomena has occurred where Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh, through aggregation, have developed a unified front whereby they're able to exploit their joint development capacity to move forward on multi-million or billion-dollar land development and other assets. So I look at those kinds of things, and last but not least, this new Liberal government speaks about reconciliation and alludes to things like, as we implement the Declaration, we need to look to the lands and resources that Indigenous peoples have rights to and that can further support their economies and the ability to raise money to provide programs and services to meet the needs of their citizens. We need to consider what the court referred to as the inescapable economic component of Aboriginal title. and how we can broaden the applicability of that concept to the ancestral lands. This is February 2017 address to the Public Policy Forum on Reconciliation by Minister Jody Wilson-Raybould. So therefore, conclusion is legislative impacts. We have to ensure that not only legislation created by Indigenous Northern Affairs is monitored, but all other federal departments, because they too have impacts on us. I'll give you an example. Musqueam, one sparrow. We have the right, the Aboriginal right to fish. And yet, legislation has now moved to the point whereby the exact area where sparrow was won is now being affected by tanker traffic, pipelines, and construction of port facilities, etc. So again, on one hand, we win, and then by not keeping our eye on the other balls that are up, we end up losing. So we look at those things, and then we look at what is the 2%. Somebody mentioned earlier about the 2% gap, and to lift the cap and lifting it. I won't mention that, but to say that, yes, be careful. And I will conclude by saying we need clear jurisdiction and authorities, incentives for economic development, and then revenues related to our service responsibilities, comparability, improved statistics. And yes, we do need a statistical institution at the regional level, not at a national level. Because when you are now seeking resources, you need that data, that hard data, to look at whether or not, at the results of whether or not you're achieving something. And when we go to Treasury Board and Parliament for resources, we have to be able to justify the needs of the monies that we're asking for. So thank you very much.